My name is Xiangjin Wei. As the holder of the N.T Wang Chair of Chinese Business and Economy and Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia's Business School and School of International Public Affairs, it's my privilege and joy to welcome everyone to this lecture series. Before I introduce our tonight's featured speaker, Professor Brautigam, let me introduce three co-sponsors of today's lecture. First, our first co-sponsor is Columbia's Weatherhead East Asia Institute, which was founded in 1949. It has been a major center of excellence for research, teaching, and publishing on modern and contemporary Asia, covering mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, the Korean Peninsula, and countries of Southeast Asia. Our second sponsor of the event is Jerome A. Chazen Institute of International Business, which serves as the interdisciplinary hub of global business knowledge at Columbia Business School. The Institute draws on the expertise of world-renowned faculty members and business leaders to help shape the thinking and discourse on major global business issues. Our third sponsor of the event is Columbia China and the World program, which is committed to integrating China's foreign relations and the field of international relations through a selective fellowship opportunities to bridge China studies and international relations together with recognized scholars in these fields. The N.T Wang Distinguished Lecture Series is named in honor of the late Dr. N.T Wang, our longtime friend and colleague, who for nearly a quarter centuries ago, foresaw the enormous potential and the need to promote greater understanding of the Chinese economy, Chinese international relations, and their implications. During Dr. Wang's tenure at Columbia, he created a vibrant dialogue among government and business leaders and research communities through the China International Business Seminar. His legacy continues as the N.T Wang Lecture Series. Now, let me introduce our featured speaker. We are extremely delighted to have Dr. Deborah Brautigam as our featured speaker. Professor Brautigam is the Bernard Schwartz Professor of International Political Economy and Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. She's a renowned sinologist with extensive Africa research experience. She's the author of over 50 journal articles and many book chapters. Her many books include The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China in Africa, published in 2010, Will Africa Feed China, published in 2015, and Taxation and State Building in Developing Countries, published in 2008. Before joining SAIS in 2012, she taught at Columbia University and American University. So Professor Brautigam, welcome and thank you very much for giving the lecture tonight. The session tonight will be moderated by Professor Thomas Christensen, the Interim Dean of Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, James Shotwell Professor of International Relations, himself a very renowned scholar on Chinese politics and international relations, and Director of the China and the World program at Columbia University. So without further ado, let me hand the event over to Professor Christensen, please. You are on mute, Tom.
Thank you very much, Xiangjin. I don't want to delay the talk anymore. I just wanted to say that my China and the World program has had the pleasure of hosting Professor Brautigam before, and we consider her a close friend of our program, and we're thrilled to have her. And welcome back, Deborah. It's just really nice to see you, and I really look forward to your talk.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks, Xiangjin, for that very nice introduction. I'm really glad to be back at Columbia. I really wish I was there in person instead of doing this virtually. But Tom and I'll tell you that we briefly overlapped at Columbia many years ago, many. at this point. So it's always good to see you and to be here. Tonight, I'm going to be sharing some of the research that we've been doing at the China Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. Our first big carry research project, which I had started during a sabbatical at the International Food Policy Research Institute in 2011 to 2012, was digging into the fact and fiction of China's land grabs in Africa. This came out in a 2015 book that was just mentioned, Will Africa Feed China? And I can talk about that more in the Q&A if you're interested. But what I want to talk about tonight is the research that we've been doing more recently. We've been doing the same kind of forensic research that was featured in that last book, but on China's overseas lending. So we did this by first developing a database with over 1,000 loans signed between Chinese lenders and African governments and state-owned companies. And this data, which is now being co-hosted by Boston University, is available in an interactive database. It allows us to track patterns. But crucially, this data is only a starting point. Our multilingual team has been doing archival research, interviews, field research to find out what's actually happening in the countries that borrow from China. We've been developing in-depth analytical narrative case studies of Chinese lending and debt relief in countries like Iraq, the former Yugoslavia, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Montenegro, and Zambia, many of which have been in the news. I first began doing this mix of archival research and interviews and field research and data collection when I was a PhD student in 1983. And I was thinking earlier I would show you a picture of that because I have one from my field research. But I decided to make this whole talk without pictures. And Tom's seen that before anyway. So today I'm not working alone anymore. And our research team includes an international corporate lawyer, 2 project finance specialists, and a bunch of lower skilled people like me, whose main training is in political science and economic development. And I'd like to give a shout out to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who's supported this research over the past 6 years. So tonight I'm going to focus on 3 themes. The talk is called China is Not a Donor. And the 3 themes are going to be first, disaggregating China. China is often portrayed as a monolithic, highly coordinated actor, but our research suggests instead that project finance from China can be highly fragmented, uncoordinated, and even chaotic. Second, Chinese finance is mainly not foreign aid, and this distinction matters for policy, for the G20, for academia. The projects we have analyzed have been poster children for allegations of predatory lending and debt trap diplomacy. Yet when our team examined them in depth, we found that they are straightforward commercial transactions, albeit with Chinese characteristics. And third, debt trap diplomacy. Some journalists, pundits, and policymakers have promoted the idea that Chinese banks deliberately lend to risky countries to secure strategic assets like ports and mines. We question the evidence for Chinese debt trap diplomacy and suggest instead that China Eximbank and the companies it serves suffer from Tazara Syndrome, which is my own term, a megaproject bias that can be traced back to the iconic Sino-African Railway of the 1970s. Okay, so let me go into these in a little more detail. So first of all, disaggregating China as a lender. Outsiders sometimes assume that overseas business of China is closely manipulated by the Chinese party state, a version of China Inc. that we've been hearing about for a few decades now. Banks and companies playing neatly ordered roles and all orchestrated out of Beijing. Although Xi Jinping has certainly centralized power far more than other recent Chinese leaders, and China's party state is exceptionally strong, China's system remains one that political scientists have long termed fragmented authoritarianism. And this fragmentation is particularly apparent in Chinese lending overseas. For example, our research found that in Africa alone, there are over 30 Chinese lenders. 30. That's a lot to coordinate. So although China's export credit agency, China Eximbank, is the largest lender overall in Africa, since 2010, it has provided about half of the loan finance in Africa. And that means the other half is those 29 other actors. China Development Bank is big, but not as big as many people think. Industrial and Commercial Bank of China is also growing. Bank of China, CITIC, and others are taking up the slack, including Chinese companies. So this fragmentation leads to collective action problems and coordination difficulties. Let me show you how this works. These lenders report to different entities in Beijing. CDB and China Eximbank are themselves at ministerial level. So it's difficult for the Ministry of Finance at ministerial level or China's central bank to control them. In principle, since 2001, large projects, at first 100 million, and since 2018, 300 million, financed by Chinese loans and insured by China's export credit agency, Sinosure, have to be approved by China's State Council. So when a company is bidding or developing a contract for a large construction project and will be seeking finance, it's supposed to get a sign-off from China International Contractors Association, and there are a bunch of other steps. I'll outline some of that. So for the first problem, China's International Contractors Association is in China's political hierarchy, it's a bureau level organization. And some of the companies that it's supposed to be signing off on their projects are at vice ministerial rank. So it's very difficult for them to actually have the power to say no there. And furthermore, the Contractors Association only has 20 days to consult a committee of experts and the Chinese embassy in the country where the project is located. So they do that, say, and after they sign off, then the borrower can apply for the loan and the insurance. And the provisional loan plan is submitted to the Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM, who coordinates with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Finance. And together, they submit the project to the State Council for approval. So this seems like a really robust web of oversight, aside from the flaws that I've mentioned briefly, at least for large loans. And yet the time frame is short. The power differentials are sometimes extreme and they matter. And there are strong incentives to refrain from throwing a wrench in the works. For example, even if business associations and economic counselors in the prospective host country believe a project risks breaching debt sustainability levels, they are unlikely to prevail if the financing bank, the implementing company, and the host government are all pushing hard for approval. So what are the implications of this? One is that Chinese lending and business development are often uncoordinated, and this helps explain why some countries have borrowed unsustainably. Take our research in Zambia, for example. Zambia was the first African country to default on its overseas bonds during the COVID-19 pandemic. Zambia has borrowed heavily from Chinese lenders, which hold about a third of its external debt. And it's a clear outlier in our data. It's one of the top 4 countries that are most indebted to China as a percentage of their national income. And it's way over, if you graph it, it's way over on the right-hand side. And when I looked at this graph, I wanted to know why. Why was Zambia this outlier and what explained it? So I had a hunch or a hypothesis derived from having spent time in Zambia doing research on 2 of my earlier books, and from also the wonderful in-depth research that has been done by C.K. Lee on Zambia. And I wondered if perhaps there were more Chinese lenders and contractors vying for projects in Zambia than elsewhere in Africa. And maybe this explains something. And so I asked our team to dig into our data on Chinese lenders and Chinese contractors. And so in our database, every project has a Chinese contractor carrying it out. So we could sort this out. And the findings were striking. Our data for 2000 to 2019 showed that Zambia was unusual. It had the highest number of separate Chinese lenders of any African country. Zambia had borrowed from 13 different Chinese lenders, banks, but also companies funding projects through suppliers' credits. So this was a lot. And furthermore, we also recorded over 30 different Chinese companies carrying out Chinese loan finance projects in Zambia since 2000, next to Angola, which has borrowed more than 4 times more than Zambia, or $40 billion. This is the highest number of different companies. And so then with this to start, we did interviews, or I did interviews and further research on project finance in Zambia and how it all works. It showed that the unsustainability of borrowing in Zambia was a function of its government frantically carrying out public works projects to win elections and not exercising restraint or oversight. Multiple Chinese lenders and companies fit right into this. Companies fishing for projects in the pool of Zambia's public finance and bringing in different Chinese lenders to back their projects. The coordination failure here I've labeled, with apologies to Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, Zambia's debt tragedy of the commons. The Chinese lenders were not being supervised. The State Council had signed off on these projects, but they had viewed each one in isolation. On its website, China's Ministry of Commerce warned Chinese banks and companies that Zambia was, quote, chaotic. 乱七八糟. And as an example of this chaos, in 2015, China's large engineering company, Sinohydro, won a $1.5 billion contract for Zambia's Kafua Gorge Lower Hydropower project. And at least 3 of the losing companies that also bid on this project were also Chinese, including China State Construction Engineering Corporation, CSCC, Dongfang, and China Guojiba Group. When the tender results were announced, CSCC wrote to the Zambia Procurement Authority, listing 39 reasons why Zambia's electricity company, ZESCO, should not have awarded the tender to Sinohydro. And CSCC then asked the Lusaka High Court to issue an injunction barring the award and held a news conference in Lusaka to protest irregularities in the process. They didn't prevail. But in a similar case in Uganda, China Construction Engineering Corporation, or CCECC, sued China Harbor Engineering Corporation, the latter supported by, no less, former US Assistant Trade Representative for Africa, Rosa Whitaker, now CEO of the Whitaker Group, for stealing away the contract for a Ugandan railway and port project that CCECC thought it had locked up. So these are just a few examples, and you can find many more if you dig. The Kafua Gorge Lower Hydropower project in Zambia was ultimately financed by a syndicate that brought together ICBC and China Eximbank and South Africa's Standard Bank also played a role there. The loans, details of which have been available on ZESCO's website, is at commercial rates. It is not a foreign aid project, and this leads me to my second point. Chinese finance is mainly not aid. So China's Belt and Road Initiative has been called a foreign assistance program by prominent political scientist Min Shin-pei, who compared it to Moscow's expansive support of Cuba and Vietnam during the Cold War. There's a cottage industry of economists and political scientists who use a global database on grants and loans coming from Chinese sources compiled by the wonderful aid data group at the College of William and Mary to do cross-national research, comparing China with other, quote, donor countries. And I can understand why scholars who do quantitative research want to assume China is a donor country, because they can then run regressions comparing Chinese aid using existing databases of Western official development assistance, or ODA, at the OECD in Paris. And it's true for the wealthy countries that transparently report their foreign aid to the OECD, which is a club of wealthy countries. Most, but not all, state-linked finance is foreign aid, or official development assistance, as the OECD terms it. But that's not the case for China. China has an official aid program. China's new foreign aid agency, CIDCA, controls its zero interest loans and its grants. And this is a maximum of $3 billion a year. And in addition, a small window at China Eximbank, the official bilateral credit agency, China's other official lending agency, China only claims to have 2, has been dispersing about $3 billion annually in concessional foreign aid loans. So in 2014, the last year China Eximbank reported these figures on its concessional loan program, this window of concessional loans accounted for only 5% of all of its outstanding loans. And then to put these figures in perspective, the US government alone provided $48 billion in foreign assistance in 2019. Of which 16 billion was military assistance. And these Chinese figures also include their military assistance. So if China is not a donor country, what is it? Well, it's an East Asian developmental state operating overseas in sectors where the easy profits are long gone. Its companies and banks are cutting their teeth in countries where risks and returns are both high and corruption rampant, and they are on a steep learning curve. But because journalists, public officials, think tank researchers, and so on who study, live, or work in these risky countries have been immersed in the world of foreign aid for so long, they don't understand how business in risky countries operates. And that's clearly not the case here at Columbia Business School, where I think I am at the moment. But so to understand this world of business, just as I had to spend time understanding the world of agriculture and investment in that field, and the world of manufacturing for earlier books and research projects, I've now been reading Scott Hoffman's textbook, Law and Business of International Project Finance. It's a great book, but it's really tough reading. And I've been collaborating with an international group of African and French lawyers and colleagues who teach courses on public-private partnerships, and international project finance, and who actively work with Chinese companies and others in this world. It's a whole new and complex vocabulary for political scientists. So Tom, let's see how many of these words you know. Escrow accounts and debt service reserve accounts, waivers of sovereign immunity, collateralization, BOTs, BOOTs, EPC plus F, take or pay agreements, confidentiality clauses, net present value, internal rate of return. So this is the vocabulary I'm dealing with now. Fortunately, I used to teach project management at CEPA, so I did know a lot of these things like net present value and internal rate of return. But these terms are hard to explain to others, and they're hard to explain succinctly. And this is why you have to spend 2 years getting an MBA at Columbia Business School in order to understand these. But let me at least try. So I'm going to use the waiver of sovereign immunity clause. So this is a clause that lies behind many of the fears that China is planning to seize assets. As headlined in the case of Mombasa Port and the standard gauge railway in Kenya, which we've done research on, the Bojoli Highway in Montenegro, which we have a paper on, and Entebbe Airport in Uganda, which has been in the news very recently, all financed by China's export credit agency. So sovereign governments like Kenya or France normally cannot be sued in other countries' courts. Under international law, they have what is called sovereign immunity. But if you are a German or American or Chinese bank, you're not going to lend to that government unless you have the right to take legal action against them if they don't pay. So all commercial loan contracts will ask sovereign borrowers and their state-owned companies to sign a waiver of this sovereign immunity. So you got that? So this simply means that if the contract has a problem, the sovereign borrower agrees that it will allow the problems to be litigated or worked out, adjudicated, arbitrated. Contracts with the World Bank don't have sovereign immunity waivers because they have other ways of getting countries to pay up. But export credit agencies use them. France's development finance agency, the Agence Française de Développement, uses them. And as one of my colleagues said, it would be grounds for professional malpractice to leave the sovereign immunity waiver out of a commercial contract. So China Eximbank used a standard sovereign immunity waiver for the expensive Bojoli Highway it financed in Montenegro. This $1.1 billion highway cuts through Montenegro's incredibly gorgeous mountains. Montenegro's government believed this would open the country to business and tourism, but other banks were reluctant to fund it. Pretty expensive. The loan contract was released by the Montenegro government, so we have the text. The sovereign immunity waiver reads, quote, the borrower hereby irrevocably waives any immunity on the grounds of sovereignty or otherwise for itself or its property, except for those assets dedicated to military or diplomatic purposes. This is a wholly unexceptional standard legal clause. However, when the contract was translated into other languages, this clause somehow became the debtor waives any immunity on its sovereign territory. And then this segued into reporters on France 24 and other TV and radio stations, including National Public Radio here in America, in Boston, focusing on the word territory and brandishing a copy of the loan contract, claiming that Montenegro had mortgaged its land to China. I mean, it's almost, I'm laughing because it's almost funny, but it's just, this was repeated in the Financial Times and in a number of other respected media outlets, and nobody looked into this deeply. So this fed into fears that China is really interested in seizing assets rather than securing an entry point into Europe's more lucrative construction market. Now, if you found that explanation hard to follow, you're not alone. These are very complex, and it's taken a team of us many months to sort out a similar false claim that Kenya mortgaged Mombasa Port to China Eximbank to pay for its standard gauge railway. I can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. We'll be publishing that research in March. So this debt finance Montenegro project was a project that other banks were reluctant to fund, and it was risky for Montenegro's government. But it also gave a Chinese company venturing into a competitive European market a beautiful mega project to use as advertising down the road. And it provides a good segue into my third topic, which is debt trap diplomacy versus Tazara Syndrome. So the debt trap diplomacy meme was invented in 2017 by an Indian pundit who observed that Sri Lanka had concessioned its strategically located, loss-making, Chinese-financed Hambantota port to a Chinese company. He implied that the whole fiasco had been orchestrated by Beijing from the beginning to secure a port with military potential. Although, as I will explain, this interpretation was not true, rumors soon spread that other Chinese finance projects were also at risk of seizure. And the Trump administration found these rumors to be a very useful way to critique the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. For example, the person the Trump administration chose to head the US Agency for International Development, who is now the head of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which has also funded my research in the past, and I thank them, wrote in Foreign Policy in 2019 that Chinese banks were, quote, targeting developing countries' strategic assets, such as their resources, mineral deposits, port access rights, and the like, as collateral in many of these predatory loan deals. So this is a standard picture. So let me tell you the Hambantota port story as an analytical narrative by a researcher. And this research here draws on collaborations with my wonderful colleague, Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School, and Umesh Moramudulai, an economist at the University of Colombo. So in 1999, the Canadian government and Canada's largest overseas construction firm, SNC-Lavalin, responded to Sri Lanka's interest in building a port in the country's poorest district, close to the major shipping lines of the Indian Ocean. Sri Lanka was then still years from ending a devastating 25-year civil war. The study was delivered in 2002, and it was quite positive, outlining a feasible $1.2 billion container port that would unfold in stages and enable Sri Lanka to be the first South Asian port to compete with Singapore for the region's transshipment traffic. The Canadian government wanted to support its largest overseas construction firm. But as so often happens, a parliamentary election and a leadership shuffle, not to mention the civil war in Sri Lanka, got in the way of the Canadian government's promotion of the project. The project was revived in 2005 when the civil war ended and there was another election. The government commissioned a second, also positive, feasibility study by a Danish global firm, Ramboll. China Harbor, one of China's largest companies, now enters the picture. They went after the contract, and then it was the Chinese government that supported the business interests of its large construction firm. So the Canadians, years earlier, had recommended a joint venture, a public-private partnership on a build, own, operate, transfer model, a BOOT. But the Sri Lankans decided to operate the port themselves. This was a disaster. The port lost money. And in 2014, after another election, a new government came to power. A lot of turnovers in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was by then facing a balance of payments crisis. According to the IMF, this was primarily caused by payments on expensive short-term foreign bonds that they had issued. Having grown out of low-income status, they had to borrow at commercial rates. It's a middle-income country, not Chinese debt. This new government decided to privatize the loss-making port to raise money. So when China Merchants Port bought 85% of the shares in a joint venture with Sri Lankan Ports Authority, and they secured a 99-year lease, the port finally took the public-private partnership form that the Canadians had recommended all those years earlier. So as I noted earlier, in 2018, the term debt trap diplomacy comes from this case. And the argument that weaponizing debt was hardwired into China's Belt and Road Initiative interested reporters at the New York Times, who published an article in 2018 with the title, How China Got Sri Lanka to Cough Up a Port. So both Meg Rithmeyer and I, every time we see that article, we just go, oh. Yet many of the most important claims in the New York Times article are surprisingly wrong. I'll just mention two. The New York Times said that feasibility studies commissioned by the government had starkly concluded that a port at Hambantota was not economically viable. Well, you've just heard me talk about two of them. That's not true. So the Canadian feasibility study, which we obtained by filing the Freedom of Information Act with the Canadian government, that took a year and a half to obtain 1,000 pages of Canadian files on this project. But they said it's feasible and they should go forward. It's also not true of the second feasibility study conducted by a Danish firm, Ramboll, which received a follow-on contract from Sri Lanka's Port Authority to design the master plan for the port. This is the master plan that China Harbor followed in building the port, not some master plan written in Beijing. So most surprisingly to me, the New York Times wrote that, quote, initially moderate terms for lending on the port project became more onerous. If this was true, it would surely be evidence that in favor of a verdict of predatory lending, but the exact opposite happened. The first Chinese loan in 2008 was at a commercial rate. It was originally signed at LIBOR plus a margin, and it was renegotiated into a fixed equivalent of 6.3% when LIBOR began trending upward right before the global financial crisis. 4 years later, when Sri Lanka applied for new loans for phase 2, they were at fixed rates of 2%. So the real story is that the terms got easier, not more onerous. But the New York Times reporters were apparently so convinced that China had deliberately laid a debt trap that they didn't notice that they themselves had changed the facts of the case to support their story. And 2 years later, the same reporting team were still misrepresenting the facts, writing, when Beijing seized a strategic seaport in Sri Lanka as collateral, debtor nations watched with concern. So, end quote. I went into some detail with the story because it's deeply shaped how Chinese lending has been viewed by intelligent and well-informed people in and outside of Africa. We see echoes of it in Kenya in worries that China intends to seize Mombasa port to pay the debts of the China Finance Standard Gauge Railway. And again, I can go into that in more detail. But this project also reflects a flaw, maybe not fatal, but a serious flaw in how China Eximbank goes about developing projects. They have an unfortunate tendency to provide finance to big public infrastructure mega projects that may not be viable for a long time, if ever. I call this the Tazara Syndrome. Tazara was the famous Tanzania-Zambia railway built and financed by the Chinese government during the Cultural Revolution. It allowed Zambia to export its copper without going through South Africa, which was controlled at the time by a combative apartheid government. Zambia tried to get the World Bank to fund the project, but they declined. Tazara was hugely expensive for China, but it's very useful today. They continue to trot it out as an iconic example of South-South cooperation. It's like a loss leader that continues to generate follow-on business for China. I've noticed that Chinese project developers are proud of funding technically demanding projects that no one else will build. How many times have you heard that the World Bank refused to fund the Shanghai Metro in the 1990s, but the Chinese did it anyway? And look how great it is. China Road and Bridges won an International Engineering Award for Kenya's Standard Gauge Railway, although the project was hugely expensive, and paying for it now is one of the prime reasons for Kenya's debt distress. The Montenegro Highway is the same kind of iconic, challenging project that might bring awards to the Chinese company that's building it, but which will leave Montenegro paying the bill for that company's European entry. Eventually, Beijing had to write off most of the Tazara Railway debt. We'll see what happens with these current projects. So in conclusion, why does it matter that China is not really a donor? It matters for two reasons. First, it's obvious now that the rise of China is the most important geopolitical event of the 21st century. It's essential to understand how Chinese actors, banks, companies, and so on actually operate overseas. And some people are doing really great work to unveil this. Sometimes there are true threats. Militarization of islands in the South China Sea, for example. But in my area of research, Chinese overseas lending, the issues that have been securitized as threats are actually complex commercial investments that pundits, journalists, and our State Department are not working hard to understand. Second, if China is not a donor country, but rather represents an East Asian variety of capital, scholars and policymakers are missing out on an opportunity to examine how our chief rival, a state-dominated, commercially oriented East Asian developmental state, really operates overseas. To compete with China, we need a clearer idea of the weaknesses and strengths of the Chinese ability to use blended finance, private capital, commercial and subsidized loans to creatively marshal the animal spirits of Chinese public entrepreneurs, moving up the value chain of overseas infrastructure businesses. So the last point I'm going to make tonight is for all the students listening in. Over the past decades, area studies has been deeply undervalued. Political science departments and economic departments prize quantitative research using large data sets, but not the field research and case study research that tell us what's really happening on the ground. So I say to you, get out into the field and find out the real story. You'll have more fun as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I just want to say amen to your last point, but that was terrific, as expected. We're so glad we invited you for this this speech and this honor, which you deserve, being the N.T Wang speaker this year. I had the privilege not only of knowing Deborah when I was a grad student and she was an assistant professor at Columbia, but I also had the privilege of taking a class with N.T Wang in the business school. And so I feel very connected to everybody here. And Shangjin's my good colleague and holds the N.T Wang chair. So I wanted to ask you a question that may seem like it's unfair and it's out of left field, but rather than strategic competition with China, between the United States and China, which is kind of what I do on a regular basis, I'm concerned about something else, which is more in your world, looking out about a year from now. And that is that I think that Zambia is the first, but not the last. I think there's going to be many countries that go into debt distress because of the pandemic in the following, in say 2022, 2023. And what concerns me is exactly your talk, that China is not a donor, it is a lender, and it wants to be repaid. And so do the other banks that lend to these countries. And many of the other banks are part of, what's called the Paris Club, that organizes lenders around the world and comes up with cooperative ways of reducing distressed debt and getting an organized response from a country in distress, how to repay the loans that's fair to all the members. And China is outside of that club and tends to treat its loans in a very different way from the members of that club, sometimes seeing them almost like trade, as if, we gave you money, you owe us stuff or something that puts them at the top of the queue for repayment in their own minds. And I wonder how that feeds into these sovereign waiver contracts, sovereign immunity waiver contracts, and the prospect that it seems fantastic now because of all the conflict in US-China relations and China-Europe relations, but the prospect that maybe 9 months from now or 10 months from now, or maybe after the midterm elections in the United States, there might be some effort to engage China in how to handle debt distress in the developing world in a way that will reduce the suffering, the long-term suffering of the pandemic in that part of the world.
Well, Tom, I am really happy that you asked that question, because this is some research that we're also doing. We've got a research project on how China does debt relief. And we started this before the pandemic, and so we've been. I couldn't talk about all of our research tonight, but this gives me a really good opening to talk about that research. So the Chinese have we have a lot of evidence on how they've done debt relief in the past. And what they usually do is they do what the Paris Club did from 1956 to 1988, which is they extend the repayment of the loans. And so right now, the Chinese are part of what's called the Common Framework. This is an organization, or it's an initiative that was set up by the G20, the group of 20, together with the Paris Club. So the Common Framework and the G20 countries that have lent to developing countries and the Paris Club members, there's overlap there, but it's not complete. Together, they're trying to work out a common methodology for dealing with debt. And they've already processed mostly one country, which is Chad. But what this is it's a learning process. And so it does take time. I don't think we can expect, despite the nature of the pandemic and the crisis, that this is all going to happen really, really quickly. And I just remind you that the last debt crisis that really started in the 1970s was not resolved until, and it still isn't resolved for some countries, but from the 1970s to 2005 with the Multilateral Debt Reduction Initiative, which led the World Bank write off its debt. So that debt crisis, and you're making me wish that I'd given a different talk today, because you'll have to invite me back, because I really can go on, for several hours about this. But the Chinese are part of the G20. They're part of the common framework, and it's rather unprecedented for them to join a multilateral effort like this. And so there are many aspects of this that we could discuss. And I'm involved in several different groups that are trying to create opportunities for the Chinese to become more transparent about their lending and to report more on it. So I'm working with the OECD and the International Institute of Finance and others on this effort. So we could talk more about that. The Chinese are not participating in that yet, but they have, there is so much, they've allowed, for example, the World Bank to publish on its website information about the Chinese lending country by country for all of the World Bank's borrowers. That's happened just since David Malpass came to the World Bank, and that's unprecedented. So that they didn't veto that, which they could have. So what I see is a lot of things that they're trying to figure out how to deal with this problem of debt. In Beijing, they're trying to figure out how to deal with it with other multilateral and bilateral lenders, and it's a learning process.
Okay, thanks a lot. You answered one of the questions who was asking whether China should do better in publicizing more of its overseas financing, and obviously you're a big advocate for that, and you're trying to cause that result. Another person raised a different narrative, which is China using the BRI and the RMB denominated loans to create internationalization of the renminbi and as a settlement trade currency, as a counterweight to the US dollar? And that's a very hot topic. It's a big narrative out there. And I think it's going to become a bigger narrative with all the sanctions on Russia, this idea of creating something besides the dollar as an international currency. So I wonder what your take on that narrative is.
I think that China definitely, this is in their interest to do more lending in RMB. They do have a lot of foreign reserves in dollars also that they need to send out there. So they have two needs. They want to put their dollars somewhere other than in US Treasury bills, which don't give a very good return. And that's where they have a lot of them invested. But sending them out in loans is, you're going to get a better return on it, even if some of these loans have to be written off or the terms need to be extended, the repayment periods need to be extended. So it is in their interest also to develop the RMB as a rival currency to the US dollar. So that having everything run in China, everything run globally on the US dollar is not how the Chinese see the future of the world in 50 to 100 years. It's not going to be all dominated by the dollar. We get, in the United States, we get a huge amount of benefits by having trade and investment all operate in dollars. And so as they become the largest economy in the world, they're going to want more things to be denominated in RMB. That's natural, and we can certainly expect that. That said, there aren't very many loans that are in RMB. So I think that that they're still going to be, there's interest in this, but we're really not seeing it. The RMB loans are still pretty much limited to the concessional loans, the Youhui Daiquan.
Okay. I think that that's what's missed in the narrative, is how many of the loans are actually done in dollars. And in many ways, the dollar gets stronger with the Belt and Road, not weaker in the international marketplace, which is an irony. So there were two questions, that one on your last point and one on a broader point about the bulk of the beginning of your talk. The one on your last point is just from a student saying, great talk, and you're a myth buster. You take down narratives and you knock them down with facts. And this person is asking, what can you say to students so that they can become better myth busters, and why these myths persist for so long, and why do they require such busting? Like, where do they come from? And then a second question is, really related to, your Tazara Syndrome argument, and, that there are quirks and unusual aspects of Chinese lending abroad that other market-based economies don't seem interested in these projects, but China goes in anyway. Sometimes it's political risk, sometimes it's just the economic nature of the project, but China goes in anyway. And you seem to be arguing they're doing it for profit, but sometimes it turns out to be fantastically unprofitable. And then the question is, so why do they do it? And if they know they're going to lose, isn't it something akin to aid in the end? If they know they're going to lose on a project, they're going to build something useful for a second country, and they know they're not going to really be repaid. Isn't that something like foreign aid?
Mm.
So those are two that I pulled out of the list.
Yeah, those are both really great questions. They're great questions. And again, I just wish we could be doing this in person. I'd love to see, the people who are asking the questions and engage more. So let me take the first one first. Why do these myths persist, and how does one become a researcher like me? Well, I'd say these myths persist in part because very few people are doing the kind of really what I've sometimes called our research methodology forensic internet sleuthing when we're doing things on the web. And then it's like being a detective. It's like being an investigative reporter. In fact, I feel sometimes like I'm doing the investigative reporting that I wish the reporters were doing, like really getting into these projects and investigating them. But I think the reason why they're not doing that is that when it's more to go into a project that's and to report it as something more sensational, like a really sensational debt trap kind of thing. It drives business at the newspapers. It goes along with, as I've written in other places, it goes along with the kind of negativity bias that we have as humans, and what we want to read in the papers. And so that kind of investigation, which the New York Times, I think, thought they were doing on the Hammond-Toda Port case, but they just didn't do it well enough. And they were already sort of pre-primed. So they thought they knew what they were looking for, or what they were going to get. And they found what they thought they were looking for. It just wasn't the right story. So then how to go about doing this kind of research? Well, it takes time. And it's not easy to do. Like, as I mentioned, the Freedom of Information Act, it took a year and a half to get the feasibility study from the Canadians, get all the project documents. It's taken, that myth came out in 2017, 2018. And Meg and I have only been publishing this research in 2020, and it just takes a long time to do the really good work to figure out what's actually happening. So it's frustrating, but it's great if you're a PhD student, because then you can do that for your research. And it means being curious, really curious, that you really want to find out what's going on. And then, of course, you have to do it as a student with theoretical frameworks and hypothesis testing and so on, but really trying to talk to people to figure out the story for your research. It's so interesting to do, actually. And contact me offline if you want to work.
What about the why question? Like, why are they doing these loans that no one else does? Is it a form of indirect aid? And then I'll just add to that question, unfairly to the question, but add to it, how much is this driven by this Belt and Road Initiative fervor that Chinese communist officials and these state-owned enterprises and in these ministries all feel like they have to jump on the bandwagon of the great leaders' constitutionally created effort to have a Belt and Road Initiative around the world, and therefore they end up getting involved in big projects that otherwise are not economically viable, not because they want to lose money, but because they're willing to take more risks because there's political payoff to being involved.
That the framing that you've just given to it right now about the BRI, there is a little something to that, but I don't think there's that much. And that's partly because the examples, a lot of the examples that I've given started before the BRI was ever announced, you know, and they've been going on for years. And it's much more it's how China is going global in this iteration. And so it's the next phase. The BRI is really the next phase of the old Do Chu Chu, the going global of the 2000s, and it's and so that this is a new iteration. And so there are a number of other points that I'm going to make on that. I don't think that the companies are thinking that this is profitable. Let me pause there. The companies are not thinking this is unprofitable. It's really profitable for the companies, and they need to get business overseas because they aren't getting that much business in China anymore. So these big engineering companies are seeking business all over the world. And the policy banks, especially China Eximbank, are there to provide the finance for that. So they are not going into this thinking it's going to be unprofitable. And so when the feasibility study, there's another aspect of it, which again, we're dealing with all of this in this Mombasa port project paper that's coming out now. But the Chinese lenders tend to go along with the borrower's desire to really have a project that they desire very strongly, because the bigger the project, the bigger the contract for the Chinese company. And up until very recently, they just assumed that these sovereign borrowers were going to repay the loans. I think they really did. And so it's been a wake-up call. It really starting about 2015 is when they started to see that this was starting to get really risky. And so we've documented this. Chinese lending in Africa peaked in 2013, the first year of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so they are responding now to the market signals. They were not going in there and trying to do unprofitable projects that they thought they were going to lose on. They thought they were getting these really big projects that no one else was going for, but they were going to get in there and get them. And there are lots of examples and stories of how that works, which will be in my next book.
Yeah, Deborah, you said something that was reported by one of our great scholars here at Columbia, Erica Downs. I think you're probably familiar with Erica Downs. She gave a great talk for China and the World on the CPEC, the Pakistan Economic Corridor, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And she said that preceded Belt and Road. And that's the biggest part of the Belt and Road. It's the biggest single project in the Belt and Road Initiative, but it preceded it by a few months before the BRI was launched. So it was going to happen anyway.
Yeah, Erica's great.
She is great. We're proud of her. Yeah. So Changjin, do you want to ask a question? I'll go back to the list if you don't, but I want to give you a chance to ask a question.
Thank you. Deborah, thank you for the fantastic talk. I was wondering whether I can follow up on your previous comment about like the New York Times article. Your interpretation is that they just got it wrong. They want to get it right, but they got it wrong. Some people in China thought that there's a general media bias. You probably heard about this. That the media tends to put most negative possible spin on anything China does. So I don't know what kind of facts we can look at to see it's right or not right. I mean, this is slightly beyond your particular point, but sort of is it potentially is a generalization, I guess, with the point you say, like so how do we tell like a different kind of interpretation which one is the right interpretation?
Well, let me say that yes, there is media bias, and that's not my opinion. This has been documented by researchers who work in media studies. And so, and one of the first really good papers that came out on this was published in 2008. And it had the wonderful title. It was by Emma Maudsley she's at Cambridge University, and economic geographer. And it was called what was it called? Dr. Livingston versus Fu Manchu in British broadsheets. So what she was documenting there was this tendency to have these really negative views of what the Chinese were doing in Africa. So that would be Fu Manchu, the devil man. And these positive views of what the West was doing, Dr. Livingston, going to and so, and she found it really interesting that the media actually, if they were just talking about like what Britain was doing in Africa, they could be negative and critical. But if they got it in with China, it became immediately like the British were doing good things and the Chinese are doing bad things. And so it was it was an interesting phenomenon. And then there's been other studies that have looked at this in recent years also, that there is a kind of general negative bias for reporting on China, particularly of China's activities overseas. So how to counter that? It's difficult. First of all, the Chinese government is doing some really reprehensible things, in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and threatening Taiwan and what's happening in the South China Sea. So there are a lot of reasons to be worried and concerned about what China does. However, it has kind of colored all of over the past 4 years of the Trump administration in particular, it's kind of colored all of what China does everywhere, so that people are just ready to believe that a port project is really a hidden, it's hiding something secret that they really want to get. It's very hard to dislodge that. What did Mark Twain say? That a lie goes around the world twice when the truth is just tying its shoelaces. So it's hard. It's hard to counter it. I don't have any really good ideas about how to do that, except by, continuing to write op-eds and things that get in there also.
So we're supposed to wrap up, but I wanted to get 2 more questions in from the students or the participants. I don't know if they're all students, and then wrap it up. And they're kind of combined. There were 2 questions. One saying, all right, it's not debt trap diplomacy. It's not designed to take away sovereign territory from other countries and create military bases, whatever. But isn't it the case that China has some kind of irresponsible economic behavior in sub-Saharan Africa that doesn't live up to the standards of other lenders? So that's one question. And then the second question is, if there are such bad practices that are less than optimal for the borrower and for China and for the world, perhaps, what's the main source of blame? I mean, what's the main problem? Is it that China has a problem in its lending, or that the recipient government has some corruption or some lack of organization or some inability to process things in a way that produces the best results, in your experience? And I'll just end with that. When you're done with answering that, I will thank you and we'll wrap up.
All right. So first of all, I'd say that the Chinese lenders have not, they actually reflect the way lenders from the West were during the 1960s and 1970s when they were lending to developing countries. Was it irresponsible? Yes. Was it irrational exuberance? Yes. They're lending in places where they think they can make money because they're getting in where others fear to tread, in the same places that our banks got into trouble, like in Latin America, not so much in Africa. But why aren't they following the debt sustainability frameworks that are set up by the IMF and the World Bank? It's because they believe in a different, they now have their own debt sustainability framework. And this was something that they've, for the Belt and Road Initiative. But there's this persistent belief that Chinese projects are going to fuel economic development, that the electricity projects and roads and ports and all of that infrastructure is going to generate growth. And therefore the countries will be able to repay the loans. So it's, in some countries now we see this as a delusion. But that wasn't very clear in 2015 when everyone thought that, Africa was rising. Well, let's say 2014 before the oil prices tanked. Everyone was talking about Africa rising. The Chinese went along with that as well. So the second thing is, what is the main problem? To me, and I've written about this in a number of places, the main problem is corruption. And it's that Chinese companies are getting kickbacks from governments that are giving them, I mean, they are giving kickbacks to governments officials who are giving them these projects. And there's this cozy crony capitalist relationship that's developed. And that's really a problem for the borrowing country, because it means that their citizens are going to have to repay these mega projects that very few of them are actually going to benefit from. It may stimulate growth and they may benefit from that in general. But how many people in Montenegro are going to, well, they may actually benefit from that highway because it's supposed to reduce traffic accidents. But nonetheless, this is going to cause, it's going to exacerbate the pandemic difficulties having to repay the debts from the Chinese.
Well, thanks so much. I wanted to thank everyone who attended. We had well over 100 participants at one point, and that's a very good participation rate. We appreciate you attending. This was a great event. The annual N.T Wang Distinguished Lecture Series is a great institution here, and it's great to have Shangjin here as the real representative, as the N.T Wang professor. And we wanted to thank the Weatherhead East Asia Institute and the Jerome Chazen Institute for Global Business and my own Columbia China and the World program for hosting this. And most of all, we wanted to thank our much beloved Deborah Brautigam for coming back to China and the World event, to a Columbia event, and sharing her wisdom and her really awesome research. I can't really think of a better exemplar of an honoree for the N.T Wang lecture than you, Deborah. And we're really glad that you accepted our invitation right away, helped us schedule it right away. It was so easy and we were so thrilled. So thanks a lot, Deborah.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Shangjin. And thank you,
everyone. Very much, Deborah.